The torches burned low in the palace corridors as a carriage waited in the shadows. Its destination, a secret only a handful would ever know. Inside, swaddled in embroidered silk, lay a newborn who would never hear the roar of a coronation crowd. They were of royal blood, yet their very existence was already being erased. For centuries, children born with Down syndrome into the world's most powerful dynasties were hidden away, their names struck from records, their faces absent from portraits. Some grew up in distant monasteries, others behind the cold walls of institutions, all under the same unspoken decree. The monarchy must appear perfect, even if it meant burying its own in life. History tried to silence them, but the shadows still remember. The royal birth chamber should have been alive with celebration, velvet drapes drawn back, midwives bustling, courtiers whispering of the heir about to arrive. But as the newborn's first cry filled the room, a heavy silence fell. The midwife froze, eyes locking with the queen's. There, beneath the embroidered silk, the tiny features told a story no one dared speak aloud. The almond-shaped eyes, the soft muscle tone, signs that, in the ruthless logic of monarchy, spelled catastrophe. In a heartbeat, the joyous script was torn apart. No bells would toll, no public announcement would declare the child's name. Instead, a senior courtier stepped forward, voice low, issuing quiet orders. The baby was passed, gingerly, reverently, yet with finality, to trusted hands. A carriage waited in the courtyard, its destination known only to a select few. By morning, the official record would say the child had been stillborn, a tragic but acceptable loss for the dynasty. The truth would be buried deeper than any grave. The infant was alive, spirited away to a remote estate, convent or institution. In the eyes of the court, this was not an act of cruelty, but of protection. Protection not for the child, but for the throne. To admit such a birth would invite whispers of weak blood, divine displeasure, or cursed lineage. These royal children were erased not by chance, but by design. Their identities were stripped before they could speak a word, their lives rewritten before they had lived a day. The crown survived on perfection, and perfection demanded that these children, innocent, vulnerable, royal by blood, become ghosts before the world ever knew their names. Monarchies were built on more than land and armies. They were upheld by myth. Kings and queens ruled not just through power, but through the image of divine favor, unshakable bloodlines, and heirs without flaw. Every birth was political theater, proof to subjects and enemies alike that the dynasty was strong. In such a world, there was no space for visible difference. A child with Down syndrome, though blameless, was not viewed as a person in need of care, but as a breach in the armor of royal perfection. Centuries before genetics explained the extra chromosome, difference was interpreted as a curse, a sign of weak blood, or an omen of downfall. Court gossip could be lethal. A whispered rumor could ripple into rebellion, alliances could fracture, and foreign courts could seize on the perceived weakness. To the crown, such risks were intolerable, and so a law unspoken yet absolute took hold: perfection or perish. It was not a written statute, but a cultural truth passed from one reign to the next. If an heir did not fit the image demanded by the throne, that heir would vanish. Officially, they had never lived. Unofficially, they might linger in hidden corners of estates or cloisters, their royal ties erased. In this cold calculus, compassion was seen as dangerous indulgence. Monarchs who kept such children risked destabilizing their reign. Those who concealed them reinforced their power. The dynasty came first, and the child, no matter their birthright, was sacrificed to the image of invincibility. In the medieval world, a child born with a visible difference did not inspire public sympathy. They provoked fear, suspicion, and whispers of divine punishment. In royal households, the stakes were far higher. An unfit heir could be read as a sign that God had withdrawn his blessing from the bloodline. Such a sign could topple thrones. The response was swift and deliberate. Infants were sent to distant estates, cloaked in secrecy. Some were given over to monasteries or convents under the guise of charity, where they would live out their days behind high walls, their existence known only to a handful of attendants sworn to silence. Others disappeared entirely from official records, their births unmarked, their deaths unmentioned. Superstition shaped these choices. The medieval mind saw difference as dangerous, something that might spread through the family, tainting future heirs. Political paranoia deepened the fear. If enemies learned of such a birth, it could be wielded as proof that the dynasty was weak, cursed, or illegitimate. Historical records betray these absences. Family trees jump suspiciously from one sibling to the next. Royal chronicles glide past gaps in the birth order. Only in private letters, dusty ledgers, or monastic archives do faint traces appear, cryptic mentions of the child or our burden, always without names. These children were not simply hidden from the world, they were hidden from history. They became shadows in an age obsessed with light, ghosts in an era that prized lineage above life. For the medieval crown, erasing them was not a choice but a necessity for survival. And for the children themselves, it was the first and final chapter in a life never meant to be seen. In the annals of royal history, erasure could be more permanent than death. A child's existence could be blotted out with a single stroke of ink. Family trees were redrawn to leap seamlessly from one sibling to the next, as if no other life had come between. Royal birth ledgers, meticulously kept for centuries, would skip a date, leave a blank, or simply never acknowledge the arrival. For those with Down syndrome, this bureaucratic invisibility was deliberate. Some names were struck through in thick lines, as though even the letters themselves posed a threat. Others were replaced with false entries. Stillborn scribbled in neat script or a short, mournful phrase. Taken too soon, that disguised the truth. Behind closed doors, the child was still alive, breathing, growing, but to the world, they had ceased to exist before they had even begun. This was not clumsiness or forgetfulness, it was strategy. A falsified death eliminated questions about succession. It sealed off gossip before it could spread. It ensured no official portrait, no court artist's brush. No poet's verse could immortalize them. Even their burial was often fabricated. An empty grave might be given a name to cement the illusion. In palaces, portraits of siblings lined the walls, except for the missing face. Public ceremonies celebrated the surviving heirs, while the absent child became a phantom in family law, unspoken and unacknowledged. To the crown, this was preservation of power. To the child, it was the theft of identity. Their life continued somewhere in obscurity, but their name, erased from record and memory, was buried forever. Beyond the palace walls, many of these children grew up in places that promised care but delivered confinement. State-run asylums and church-run hospitals accepted them quietly, without fanfare, their royal heritage concealed under plain clothing and assumed surnames. These institutions were far from the opulence of court life. Cold stone corridors, peeling paint, the scent of antiseptic barely masking the air of neglect. Despite noble blood, they were treated no differently from the poorest patients. Beds were crammed side by side in drafty dormitories. Meals were functional, not indulgent. Medical care was minimal, often limited to what the staff could spare between tending dozens of others. Days followed a rigid routine. Wake, wash, eat, wait. Visits from family were rare, sometimes years apart, sometimes never. A mother might send clothing or a small gift through an intermediary, but appearances were avoided to prevent recognition. Staff were often instructed to keep the child's true identity a secret, even from the child themselves. These institutions became their whole world. Some formed quiet friendships with other residents, shared laughter in rare moments, or found joy in simple activities. But there was no escaping the knowledge, if they were ever told, that a palace had once been their rightful home. They were not prisoners by law, but by decision, a decision made in the name of preserving the throne. Their gilded cage had no gold, only walls that kept them invisible. In the polished image of the modern British monarchy, the story of Nerissa and Catherine Bowes' lion was a crack that could not be hidden forever. Born in 1919 and 1926, these first cousins of Queen Elizabeth II showed signs of significant intellectual disabilities, possibly Down syndrome. Instead of being raised within the royal household, they were placed in the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey, a long-term institution for those with learning disabilities. Once admitted, they all but vanished from public knowledge. In an astonishing act of erasure, official Burke's peerage records falsely listed both sisters as dead. Nerissa in 1940, Catherine in 1961, decades before their actual deaths. This was not a clerical error. It was a deliberate rewriting of history. Life in Earlswood was far removed from royal privilege. The sisters lived among hundreds of other patients, dressed in standard uniforms, sharing common dining halls and dormitories. Records suggest they had almost no visitors from their family. Nerissa died in 1986 and was buried in a simple grave marked only by a plastic tag. Catherine remained in the institution until its closure in the 1990s, later moving to a care home where she died in 2014. Their existence became public only in the 1980s, when journalists uncovered the truth. The revelation caused public outrage, not only because of their abandonment, but because it proved such practices were not relics of medieval cruelty. They had happened within living memory, in the reign of a queen who symbolized modernity and tradition alike. The scandal was a reminder. Even in an age of television and transparency, some royal children were still consigned to the shadows. Not every royal child with Down syndrome was cast into the shadows of an institution. A few rare families chose to keep them close, loving them openly within the safety of private walls, even if the public never knew their names. Princess Alexandrine of Prussia was one such child. Born in 1915, she remained in her parents' care, a quiet presence in family homes and gardens. She appeared in photographs and postcards, her smile captured alongside siblings, but her role in royal life was deliberately limited. She was shielded from court duties and public scrutiny, her life shaped by affection but bounded by invisible barriers. Anne de Gaulle, born in 1928 to Charles de Gaulle and his wife Yvonne, was another rare exception. Though not royal, she belonged to one of Europe's most prominent families. Anne was deeply cherished, especially by her father, who spoke of her with tenderness and pride. She was raised at home, surrounded by love, rather than sent away. Yet even in this warmth there was distance from public life. Her condition was rarely discussed, and she seldom appeared at official events. These families broke from tradition, choosing presence over abandonment. But even in their defiance of the old rules, they operated within the quiet boundaries of the time, protecting their children from public cruelty, yet also from public visibility. Love was given, but in the shadows. For centuries, when royal children disappeared from the public record, many found themselves within the custody of religious institutions. Monasteries, convents, and church-run hospitals became the silent keepers of these hidden heirs. The arrangement was cloaked in piety, portrayed as an act of mercy, placing the child under God's care. In reality, it was often a transaction, serving both the monarchy's need for discretion and the Church's role as an unquestioned authority. Some institutions provided genuine compassion, offering safety, education, and simple routines. Others, however, became warehouses of the unwanted, facilities where the child's royal heritage was concealed, their name replaced with a saint's, their lineage erased from memory. Records were altered or sealed, ensuring that even centuries later, their connection to the crown would remain unknown. In sermons, these removals were framed as God's will, a necessary step to protect the monarchy from scandal and the child from worldly cruelty. Yet behind the sanctity of stone walls, the truth was more complex. These children were not simply sheltered. They were removed from succession, stripped of identity, and folded into the anonymous ranks of those the world forgot. The Church's complicity was not always malicious. In some cases, it was the only institution willing to care for such children. But by agreeing to hide them, it became an accomplice in the quiet rewriting of history. And once cloistered, few ever returned to the life their birthright promised. The last century brought a revolution in how the world understood Down syndrome. Once seen through the lens of superstition and fear, it came to be recognized as a genetic condition, one that did not strip a person of dignity, worth, or potential. Medical advances improved life expectancy. Education systems opened their doors. Advocacy groups emerged, demanding visibility and inclusion. Public attitudes shifted. Where once families hid their children, more began to introduce them proudly to their communities. Laws were passed to protect the rights of people with disabilities, ensuring access to education, healthcare, and employment. Royal families, too, began to change. Though slowly, some acknowledged disabled relatives openly, integrating them into public life instead of concealing them. Media coverage played a role in dismantling old stigma. Stories of individuals with Down syndrome achieving in sports, arts, politics, and business challenged stereotypes that had endured for centuries. The condition was no longer a whispered shame. It became part of a conversation about diversity, acceptance, and the value of every life. Yet this transformation was recent, fragile, and incomplete. The distance between medieval secrecy and modern acceptance spans only a few generations, and history's long shadow warns that progress can be reversed if vigilance falters. Behind every erased name was a life, a child who laughed, cried, dreamed, and deserved to be loved. They were not royal scandals. They were sons and daughters, brothers and sisters, whose only fault was to be born different in a world that demanded sameness. History tried to make them invisible, but remembering them restores what was stolen. We honor Nerissa and Catherine Bowes-Lyon, Alexandrine of Prussia, Anne de Gaulle, and the countless unnamed children whose stories never reached the light. Their lives were not failures of bloodline, but failures of compassion from those sworn to protect them. By speaking their names now, we undo, in part, the silence that smothered them. We replace shame with acknowledgement, secrecy with truth. Their existence is a reminder that power, no matter how great, is hollow if it demands the sacrifice of the most vulnerable. The lesson they leave is clear. A society is measured not by the perfection of its image, but by the humanity it shows to its weakest members. The monarchy's need for control erased these children once. Memory must not erase them again.